Start recording, maybe we'll get. Thank you for that. All right, thank you all for giving up a lovely evening, at least here in June, to join our final Salon Series presentation of the year. I'm happy to have all of you in attendance, and I'm looking forward to Kelsey's research and then to sharing some conversation with our panelists. So my name is Ellen Whiteman, and I'm the manager of McDowell Foundation. Foundation funds teacher-led research here in the province, such as the project you're going to hear about tonight. And I have to say, I'm quite excited to hear from Kelsey. I think there's going to be some great work shared. So to start the evening, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional homeland of the Métis. I do this land acknowledgement from a genuine desire to recognize the importance of treaty and my own place on this land, and most importantly, my relationship with the Indigenous people of this land. Thank you for sharing it with us. Thank you for giving us a connection to the land through treaty. Joining us tonight are leaders from across the province and beyond. I'm not going to go through the list, but I'm very excited to know that many people are interested and care about what our teachers have to say about distance learning and are interested in Kelsey's research. And I look forward to hearing the conversation with you. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for, again, giving up this lovely evening to join us. Our panel tonight consists of our final directed call researcher, Kelsey Shields. And the focus of this work was really in response to a directed call we put out in July of last year. When we sent out the call for special funding, I'm not sure we actually knew the impact COVID was going to have on our education system, but we did know that we were in a historic and unprecedented time and that research specifically focusing on this would be important. If you attended the Salon Series in April, you heard from the other three teams, and I'm excited that Kelsey is able to support our research tonight. Hence why we called it COVID Lessons from School Part 2. We're also fortunate to have Professor Jay Wilson from the College of Education join us, Jay Salakin from our STFPL, which is the professional learning aspect of the Federation. So we're going to have two J's, so that might get a bit confusing. We'll do our best. And Lisa Hodson from the STF join our panel. So just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Kelsey's going to share for about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes about her research, and then we'll start being able to direct questions to the full panel. If you would like to participate, and we hope you do, we'd invite you to either put questions in the Q&A and they'll be directed to, and who you'd like to direct them to on the panel, or if they're the full panel, or if you have comments you'd like to make, feel free to put them in the chat. If you'd like, you may also raise your hand and JS will unmute your mic and invite you to speak. We are recording this session because we've had a number of individuals indicate they can't attend, and know that it'll be available on the McDowell website and through social media within the next week. Jay Salkin will also be providing some technical support for us. He's doing a bit of double duty for us tonight. So if you're having issues, feel free to send Jay a private message and he should be able to respond. So Kelsey, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining me here tonight. I'm just a little bit nervous, but I'm excited to share with you my work. So I'll just give you a little background about myself. So I am a doctoral candidate with Athabasca University. This is my 5th year in the program, and I am also an administrator in the Good Spirit School Division, southeastern corner of Saskatchewan. So I am a rural Saskatchewan girl at heart. I grew up in rural Saskatchewan. I left for a little while to complete my degrees. My bachelor's degree I completed in Philadelphia, and I returned home to Saskatchewan, and I've been here ever since. So I love Saskatchewan and I appreciate rural Saskatchewan, which is partly why it has driven my research in this area as well. I'd like to, just as an act of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which I am presenting is Treaty 4 territory, signed September 1874 at Fort Qu'Appelle, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Assiniboine, and the homeland of the Métis peoples. Acknowledging territory shows recognition of and respect for the Indigenous peoples, both in past and present. And we pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. So I'll start with my research questions. My overall or overarching research question was, how do public school educators in Saskatchewan K-12 schools perceive the state of distance education in the province? So I focused on public schools, public school educators, and the K-12 sector. I have 4 sub-questions that have helped to drive my data collection and research, and 2 of them, the first 2, have to do with the positive and valuable experiences that our public educators experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the focus really is from the spring of 2020, so that March to the end of June of last year. And then what are the barriers that public educators in K-12 distance education in Saskatchewan are facing or were facing during the COVID-19 pandemic? And then the last 2 focusing on possible steps for development that can improve access and opportunities within the formal education system in Saskatchewan, distance education in Saskatchewan, and possible steps for future research that can improve access and opportunities within the formal education system for distance education in Saskatchewan. The research, the pool of research in K-12 education is quite small, and then you add in distance education and it gets even smaller yet. So there's not a lot of research out there, and so hoping that we can have some possible steps to drive further research. So in total, I had 16 participants in my work. I used social media and an open invitation to school divisions, public school divisions, and it was a very quick response. I was hoping and praying that I would get 15, and I had probably 40 to 50 participants reach out within the first 48 hours. So some fell into the criteria quite well, and others did not. So 16 was my magical number, and I divided the province into 4 areas. And so the Northeast, Northwest, Southeast, and Southwest, wanting to make sure that I had at least 1 participant in each of those areas. The southern part of Saskatchewan, really more populated, and did present a few more participants than the northern areas, but I did get 1 from each area at least, which was my goal, and 10 from the Southeast and 4 from the Southwest. Teaching experience was also noted within the data, and 0 to 5 years of experience, I had 8 participants in that realm. 6 to 10 years, I had 2, and 11 to 15, I had 4 participants, and then 21 to 25 years, I had 2 participants. And the spread throughout the grades taught by my participants was fairly equal across the board. Some teachers or participants taught in multi-grade situations, so they might fall into more than one of those categories. And so I was quite happy to see the high school was represented, and K-2 had some representation, and 3 to 5, and then 6 to 8. So I was very happy with the gamut of participants in that realm. The findings I've composed from the email interviews. So the one email interview went out, and I would correspond the second time with my participants. So the second time after the response came back, then the interview was finalized. And from that, I used to build on my conceptual framework. So I built a conceptual framework to help drive my research questions and really what I was looking for. I built my conceptual framework off of the work of Corey and Stella, and I focused on 5 areas that really would provide a solid basis for distance education. And so I was looking for these 5 things in the data that I had collected. And the largest part of my conceptual framework, you'll see when it's all completed, is the learner at the very top of my framework. I put it in a little bit bigger font as well, because ultimately that is what my research is here to help improve, is the experience for the learner in Saskatchewan. And so this area of my conceptual framework was represented quite strongly within the data. There was a lot of feedback from participants in terms of characteristics of the learner and what they thought provided a good experience or a negative experience in some cases as well. So the learner consists of the characteristics really of the Saskatchewan K-12 learner, and enrolled in distance education courses. And so the variety of themes that really popped up with the learner came from the viewpoint of their teachers. So we have to remember that as well. This was really came from the participants. But the biggest shining light in this area is what is referred to as the digital divide. Every single one of my participants referred to the digital divide as being a very challenging aspect of COVID-19 during the pandemic. And so the digital divide really refers to the lack of access to technology that the learners may have had, possibly insufficient Wi-Fi and internet access. Something that I really didn't think about, but a lot of the participants referred to the fact that some of their families had a large number of students or a large number of children, which added to the digital divide because they didn't have enough devices for multi-student homes. And so that was a challenge for some of our participants. And then inconsistent technology. So lots of participants referred to the fact that the technology they possibly were using was not compatible with what some of the students were using, and so that caused some difficulty as well. So this was a very common theme that came up within the data. Some of the participants were very thankful that their divisions provided technology to their learners and also hotspots to their students, which was very helpful, while others described cases where even they as teachers were dealing with the digital divide. So trying to teach in an environment where they alone did not have access to the internet and technology. Parent involvement of the learner was also discussed, whether it was the need for it or the lack thereof. And so a lot of discussion around the age of the learner. So some of the viewpoints on the younger learners in the K-12 sector was that they were very dependent upon an adult to help them. And the challenge was also the fact that many of those adults were working from home as well. So that caused a lot of stress in various situations for families, where they were trying to juggle a working from home experience as well as a distance education experience. The student learner itself, they talked a little bit about an increase in confidence with the learners, especially those learners who struggled a little bit more with peer pressure in a face-to-face classroom, or just the extra pressures that they may have felt in a face-to-face classroom where this experience was actually a positive one for those students. And also the opportunity to maybe increase some individualized support where they had maybe a lack of motivation from other students, and an increased motivation where they could really meet the needs of those students one-on-one. Mental health of students, I don't think this is really a secret, but this was a major theme also that came up in the data. So lots of positive feedback on the students who were able to access distance education, who maybe struggled with bullying within a face-to-face classroom and were able to really find solace in an online environment. But on the other hand, also describing situations such as student athletes who were experiencing high levels of anxiety due to the fact that they weren't able to access their athletics, and therefore an increase in mental health struggles. Lots of description as well on how overwhelmed school counselors were during this time, trying to meet the needs of all of these students in an online environment. The diversity of learners was also a common topic. Lots of reference to students who are on individualized program plans that perhaps weren't academically based, maybe more so life skills or behavior based, and many of the participants found that very difficult to meet the needs of those students in an online environment. The age of the learner, as I discussed a little earlier, was also a factor. Many found that the older the students were, the less reliant they were on adults, therefore easier to remain motivated. And the incomes of families were also had an effect on the learner. So discussing the challenges some of the low-income families were facing, and really how that also had an influence on their distance education experience. So many of families struggling with nutrition or stable housing or technology or lack thereof. Again, the digital divide had an impact on those learners. The second area of the conceptual framework was administrative leadership. And in this area, it focuses on the direction provided by school divisions, as well as the Ministry of Education, and the partnerships developed between the influential groups involved in distance education. And three themes emerged. And so one of the themes was focused on the idea of supplemental learning. So there were many negative viewpoints shared towards the optional learning, and felt that as soon as that distance education portion of thing was made optional, many of the students became less motivated and less engaged. And so the incentive to continue learning was described by, or the lack of incentive to continue learning was described by multiple participants, and largely had an effect on the learner themselves. School administrative support, there was a lot of discussion around various levels of administrative support, and what the participants had experienced was they appreciated a lot of the support that was just there for them, just their mental health. How are they doing? How are they making through the situation, and not necessarily about what they were teaching. And so there was a lot of description on various ways school administrators had completed that. Some had popped in just to check in informally on staff, and some had access to their online environments. Yet they really did look fondly upon just the check-in and seeing how everyone was doing. The level of collaboration was also mentioned by school divisions, or the lack thereof of the collaboration amongst the school divisions. So 10 of the 16 participants did write about the lack of collaboration that did take place, and whether that was due to the quickness of the shift to the online environment, but many participants have expressed their wishes to see that happen a little bit more. Thirdly, professional development and foundations. So this focuses largely on preparation and sustainment of the teachers involved in distance education, and the professional development that they received or did not receive. And so two themes did emerge here: the professional development for teachers themselves, and the post-secondary experiences of teachers, including university coursework and student teaching. So teacher collaboration was talked highly of. Lots of teachers used social media to reach out to each other, sharing ideas. Division professional development was also discussed, whether it was mandated or optional. And many of the participants appreciated the fact that the optional PD was available to them, so that they could cut off or bite off pieces, I guess, per se, that was manageable for them as they were trying to maneuver through a pretty stressful situation. When addressing the post-secondary experiences in student teaching, there was not one participant who could attest to student teaching experience in an online environment. Some attested it to their age, because when they were in university, the internet maybe wasn't quite as popular or even really existing. And so that was an interesting find for me. They talked about the coursework necessarily that they have taken in university at a university level did not necessarily teach them how to teach in an online environment, but more so focused on the tools that could possibly be available for them in elective courses that they may have taken. So an interesting find there in terms of professional development. Sorry. Digital pedagogy was the fourth theme and part of my conceptual framework, and it consists more of the instructional planning, strategies, approaches to learning, delivery of instruction, elements of instruction, the interaction amongst the learner and participants, engagement of the learners, and assessment practices. And quite a bit came up in this area of the conceptual framework as well. And so one participant, and I quote this participant in saying that in order to effectively teach remotely, teachers need to have a good grasp of how to use technology. And that was a big theme that came out in the data. So those participants that struggled with technology prior to distance ed or hopping into the supplemental learning really struggled through the experience that they had during COVID-19. Time that also was required to convert a lot of their lessons to an online environment was a factor. which added to their teacher workload. And so that was an issue for a lot of the participants. Assessment practices was also discussed as a struggle. The participants could not understand how to assess in those areas. They also experienced frustration in the fact that the supplemental learning didn't necessarily lead to assessment practices. And so there was a bit of confusion as to, do we evaluate student work? Do we not evaluate student work? And how do we do that? So it was more so along the lines of, how do we effectively do this and communicate with students the description of how well they're doing. So a lot of the concerns also came from, they weren't sure if the student was, or if the learner was completing work on their own, how much parental influence did they have? And so that was a common discussion point as well. Lots of frustration in this area with communication as well. They're used to teachers describe their ability to read facial expressions, physical, how students are acting in a face-to-face environment, and all of a sudden that is gone. So being able to recognize when a student is struggling with something they feel was a much easier thing to do in a face-to-face environment. So the body language, missing of that body language was definitely a factor for a lot of the participants. Competing with the other distractions in the learner's life as well in a home environment posed more difficult as that time frame also went on. And so that was also described as part of the challenges that our participants had. And the final component of the conceptual framework was effective evaluation. And so evaluation of the effective practice of distance education. And that includes effectiveness of online learning, student and teacher evaluation in distance education environments, and quality indicators of online learning. So what makes a good quality distance education experience? And two themes did develop around assessment and evaluation of student learning, as well as evaluation of teacher expertise. So a number of the participants expressed a similar negative mindset due to the optional aspect of the learning, which caused the lack of motivation from students to complete assignments, student frustration, and no end to the means, I think is what a few of the participants had described it as. Most participants described situations where official evaluations of their teaching expertise were postponed due to the pandemic, although some did express their frustration with the continuation of evaluation. And so that really came across fairly strongly as unfair, as they felt that they did not have the proper training in an online environment, and they were getting evaluated on this experience of theirs. So they definitely felt a little bit shortcoming by that evaluation process. So these 5 components of the conceptual framework did really provide a pretty detailed basis as to what works well to create that distance education environment, and the barriers that are also involved in that distance education environment. So where do we go from here? I think there's a few really strong themes that did come out of the data. One big theme was the digital divide. How do we address that digital divide in Saskatchewan? And I do know that there is some conversation out there around this, and it's rural Saskatchewan that's really a concern from this data. Also, the professional development for our teachers. It's not that our teachers don't have the experience of the teacher or the technology tools, it's the skills of how to teach in an online environment. How do we engage our students? How do we meet those needs of our students in an online platform? And so that could be an area where we can strengthen that in the province of Saskatchewan. And just simply the structure of distance education in Saskatchewan. What does the funding model, how does that affect distance education in Saskatchewan, and how can we get school divisions to collaborate more in terms of how we provide that option for our students in Saskatchewan? And I think in the end, just the recognition that distance education is not simply taking a face-to-face classroom and moving it online. And I think some of the participants experienced that for themselves and with frustration, as I think that was a myth. I think that some people do just believe that it's not taking somebody who simply is comfortable in a face-to-face environment, and meaning that they would be comfortable in an online environment and confident that they can do the job that they're set out to do. So that's a pretty important piece to take away from the data as well. And I will leave that as a question period for anyone who has any questions.
Does anyone have any questions directly for Kelsey before we move to the full panel? All right. Ian Cripps, who's the Associate Executive Director of the STF, has been making me practice my pause. So how long do you appropriately leave a pause? So hopefully that was long enough. There will, of course, be opportunity for you to direct questions straight to Kelsey as we continue to move on as well. So just as we reflect on the work that you provided, Kelsey, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate the having that kind of wide breadth of information and the number of themes that you came up with. I mean, I know this is your research and research for a degree, but I'm very impressed with what you've been able to pull from that over a short time. As we reflect on it, though, and I'm going to invite the panel to reflect on it, but maybe I'll give you first shot at it, Kelsey, if you would like. How do you see that March to June period where literally everyone went online and students were given the option of joining their teachers or not? How do you see that impacting distance learning moving forward? How do you see that, what do you see that doing for distance learning in the province, which of course existed prior to COVID and has continued to exist this year in a number of forms and will exist moving forward? What impact does that time when every teacher moved online, what will it have? So why don't we start with Kelsey on that one, if that's okay?
Sure. I think that it has changed the, I guess, horizon of education forever. I don't think we can go back and say we have not had that experience of teaching in an online environment. And I think it has exposed everyone in the education system to that platform, and which may not have happened or would not have happened prior to. So I appreciate the fact that we all had a little taste of what that might look like, and I think it highlighted in some areas the places that need some work, and I think it also brought a positive light to what distance education can provide to our students in Saskatchewan in general. So
thank you. Do the other panelists want to weigh in on the same question?
Well, I never met a good question I don't like. So I just want to, first of all, thank Kelsey for undertaking this work, and it is very important. And she identifies a pretty significant gap in our understanding in the province from a research perspective. So I hope that McDowell, with that wonderful support, doesn't have to do a directed call in the future, that people will see value in continuing to do this. But I really think that this is an opportunity. I think what we've gone through, I mean, we are surviving it. And when I say we, I mean teachers across the province, both in K-12 and post-secondary. But the idea of how quickly things have sped up, there are a number of us, even on this call, who have done online learning and distance learning for a long time, but it was really a niche. And what we have done now is we've exposed good and bad, but opportunities to really make it a key part of all of our instruction and to provide some flexibility. And like Kelsey said, the time frame has moved at light speed over this past year. And certainly in her research, when people were launching into it for the first time, there was a lot of trepidation, but there's also a lot of expertise in this province. And once we put in some better systems, I think, of supporting in-service and pre-service teachers, it will improve and move beyond what I think is already pretty good, but not mainstream yet.
I just add to that. Yeah, no, I agree with everything that's been said. And I mean, distance learning isn't new. It's been around for a long time, but it has been very, very specific, I would say. And there'd be, in my experience anyway, a lot of it was asynchronous, very structured, planned, and there was time to, but it wasn't for all students. It didn't serve all purposes. It didn't have resources to support all the needs of students. And I think COVID really brought that out, the lack of what distance learning does provide for all students. And I mean, distance learning teachers do a phenomenal job. And what our teachers did in COVID to adapt so quickly to what they needed to do. And I know for some teachers, it wasn't as big of a leap because they had that experience in technology and were using it already in their classrooms. But for a lot of teachers, it was very, very stressful, and what they had to do to adapt to these online platforms that they were being asked to put on there, never mind all of the other things that they were dealing with COVID. So definitely some benefits that we can take from that. Just a definite increase in technology and the benefits of using that even in the classroom as teachers continue to do that work with students will definitely be something that's positive.
So, and even when we were all sent home in March, and the panic set in with everybody, and what we were noticing, or our biggest fear was, this isn't really distance education or online, like this is emergency remote teaching is what we were calling it. And realizing that we were throwing teachers out saying, good luck, you know, and they didn't really get the support. And there was just no time. Nobody could provide them that support in that time. So normally when an online course is written, there's a whole semester and that teacher gets a period a day to develop it. And it becomes they get lots of time to do that. So I think it got better going into the fall. And I also think that students, some realized that maybe this isn't as scary as they thought, and some students actually enjoyed it. So most of the work that I do is with teachers, and we're finding, we didn't do anything online before March. And now, since everything has been online, we haven't had the choice to get together face to face yet, but the adapting and the learning that teachers did in the last year has been phenomenal. And there's, the silver lining is I think there are lots of things that we can use to help teachers learn moving forward using this technology that they may not have in the past.
Thank you for that. I think back to that time in March when all of us were sent home, and all of our kids were sent home too, and how it was just such a short period for everyone to adjust. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that teachers were phenomenal in how they pivoted. I mean, that's been the key word the last 18 months, pivot. And it was phenomenal. But then thinking about into the fall, as there was more time and as there was this funny concept of blended learning. And I'd like to pick up that a little bit, Kelsey. And I know that wasn't directly around your research, but I'm curious as to what impact that phenomenon has had on distance learning and on how we're going to think about distance learning moving forward. Because I know, wearing my SDF hat for a second instead of my McDowell hat, we've been having a number of conversations about what does this now look like? The Pandora's box has opened, so to speak. What does it now look like that all classes this year have an online component to them, at least in the form of a Google Classroom, or at least most of them do, So reflecting on this came out of a crisis, what are the impacts of some of these kinds of things online or being online long term? Well, and again, I'm just going to invite people to jump in.
Yeah, I think the blended learning, is an opportunity now that teachers are looking at, being that everyone has had a little bit of taste of what teaching in an online environment is like. And so I think for many teachers, and I can speak for some that I know, I think they are going to take the little snippets of their experiences and continue to use them, because they really did work well and they could do it. And they found out, I can do this, after the initial shock of, oh my, we're going into online and we don't know what we're doing, kind of faded away. I think they've taken away the positives of the experience and continue to use it in their classroom. And I think it's a great opportunity for many of our teachers. And really, what's the best way to learn is to jump in and do it. And really, we didn't have a choice as teachers. We jumped in and we had to do it. And you take something away from that every single time. And I think if our teachers can leave their experience and incorporate online distance education somehow into their face-to-face classrooms, that's a win in this situation. And I think going forward, many will do that. And they did an excellent job in attacking that and moving forward and continuing to use it. So I think it's a positive for education in Saskatchewan.
So while it's, I 100% agree to pull those positives out, because there are so many. And I think, you really grow when you are forced to do something and you dive right in and you just do it. And teachers did, they just step up and they just do it. I also think it's important that we look at what were the positives, but what also were challenges where maybe distance learning isn't the best mode of instruction for certain situations and students. It isn't. We were in survival mode in the spring, and I would even argue that this whole year has been survival mode still, even though teachers and students have been back in the classroom. Teachers are still dealing with the hybrid learning and supporting students who can't be in the classroom for long periods of time. So they're trying to support them, and technology is being used and all of that, but it's also stretched teachers, I think, beyond a point that's reasonable. I think that if anything, if it's going to be sustainable, it needs to serve the right purpose for students and for teachers, and it needs to be reasonable and manageable for it to be sustainable. So I think there is work ahead, and I like what you said at the beginning, Kelsey, with the research, future research. There isn't a lot out there, and we do need that research on what distance learning can provide, what it can do, the effects that it has, the pros, the cons, when is it appropriate. And so all of that work ahead, and it's important that teachers have a voice in that planning that happens, and that they were the ones that did all of the work and went through that experience. And teachers have a lot of professional practice and their expertise and everything that they experienced through this whole ordeal. I think their voice will be very, very valuable down the road, and currently and down the road.
I know, Ellen, you're going to say we have a question in the chat. Can I just respond to the flexible one first?
Actually, I would invite you to do that, and then we'll move to the chat. But Jay, I'd very much like you to respond first, and then we'll keep rolling.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that my excellently named counterpart said in terms of emergency, the ERT teaching that people went through. And I think that was one stage. And then I think the next stage we had a little bit more prep time, like Lisa said, but wasn't ideal. But I think people now have a better understanding, and you don't have to like it, but at least people can speak the same language. We can say why it doesn't work for me or for some of my students. And I think it's like one huge gap analysis that we were able to go through and find out where the small holes are and the big holes and the wins as well. And there are all kinds of good and bad coming out of this. And I think that's that information that we really need. We know that students in our specialized programs in particular struggle, and this past year, parents I've talked to and teachers, they just feel like somehow we just didn't have a great system before, or was stretched before, and then when the pandemic arrived, the system snapped in a number of areas. So I think it's really important for us to think about how we are looking at the big picture, and not just what's classroom practice. Well, that's one part of it, but we have all of these other important services that we provide students that really we've shone a light on them and exposed them for where we can continue to do better. We talk about resiliency of our learners, and that has never been more evident than now with oh, you're in school this week, oh, 2 weeks from now you're out of school, and their ability to move back and forth and to roll with the punches. And that's certainly not everybody, but the blended learning is now something people understand. They may never want to do it again, but at least they know what the options are. And then other people are able to, like parents are able to understand it as well. And I think that those are some of the positives.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. And then to just be able to take those good classroom practices and adapt them to something online. Now, it might not be the same, but you need to still meet that outcome somehow. So, I think a lot of the public had the idea that distance learning is you're sitting in front, so the teacher is talking and the kids are listening, and it's like a lecture, when really there's so much more to it, and there's so much more that can be done. And I think Raquel, I noticed, was in our, she's been leading some of the blended learning opportunities for teachers, and a lot of the processes that teachers can do to still make an engaging experience for students, but they need to be taught that. So if teachers haven't learned, like, it's not that they can't do it, it's just, they hadn't seen it or been exposed to it. And school divisions were struggling to make that work. So I think as school divisions move forward now, it's, well, let's take what we learned and what can we take from this and move on. And that's my biggest wonder is, what are we going to keep and what are we going to revert back to?
And that's a great transition into the question that is in the chat, because I think this is very much looking at what is the impact going to be. So the question is, how does the COVID-19 understanding of distance education by parents influence our post-pandemic thinking for education? I think that's a great question. Now that parents have had a taste of it, seen it, experienced it, how is that going to shift education as we move out of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you could probably find some parents that would praise the teachers in their lives a lot more than they did maybe prior to. But I do think it gives them a whole new even appreciation on education and their own children. And so some of the participants that participated in my research were also parents. And so they talked about it from a parent perspective and how they even shifted their thought process as a parent. And so it's a very interesting dynamic when you throw in parents, and how it'll be interesting to see how they support the development of distance education as well. Will they support that and as we move forward? And so I'm very interested to see, even as we get out of COVID and into more of a calming environment per se, because I would say we're still probably, education is still very much in a, I don't want to say turmoil, but it is kind of still in a turmoil for sure, as various schools are still, they're bumping back all the time. And so that's definitely been a factor. Yes, definitely PTSD. I would say that's a good descriptor of what some people have experienced. And so it will be very interesting to watch that shift after we're kind of out of the eye of the hurricane per se, how their views will shift.
Anyone else want to jump in here?
Sure, I can, as a parent as well, someone who experienced it, and coached some other parents and talked to lots of teachers about it. I think one of the key messages that I heard from other parents was the need for consistency and evidence that it's working. I think that it was, unfortunately, some teachers struggled, some found great success, a good number were in the middle, but that lack of consistency really drew people's attention to what was going on. And they were, in the past, we just assumed we knew as parents everything about education, and we bundled off our children to the safety of the school and the care of the teachers. And we knew that some teachers did things differently and some are more successful than others, but we didn't have that level of magnification. And I think with what we have done now, like has been mentioned, people took a greater interest, a greater appreciation as well. But yeah, I think we will have parents maybe more engaged in that sense because they want to know what's going on. They have seen the impact on their children. They've also experienced it. I have friends with 5 kids, and every classroom was different, and some would be at home, and some would be blended really well, and some they would talk to the teacher once every 2 weeks, and it was all over the place. And that was the one message that I heard, is that if we're going to do it, we can do it well, but I think that there's a real need for consistency. And that gets back to some of the key messages from Kelsey's research in terms of the need for training. We at the universities, we have to do a better job. This past year, our students were exposed to online learning forcibly, I guess, like everyone else. So our graduates are coming in with that understanding. Many of them were teaching in this new environment as well. So it's a way of opening up discussion and trying to respond to the needs of parents, as well as trying to support our pre and in-service teachers.
I'm just going to go back to the reasonable and manageable part of it, because I know that if this was a first experience for parents on what distance education is, it's not, I think, a reasonable one as far as what it normally looks like and what it can offer. I think that it's not going to, like, distance learning pre-COVID is not going, like, post-COVID, it's going to look different because we've learned so much. And I actually think it's going to be a lot better because of it, because there will be more supports available and addressing needs of students that need those additional supports, and hopefully increased resources and professional development for teachers. All of that will make it better. But to be mindful that what teachers have been doing this past year and what they were doing in the spring is probably not likely sustainable for teachers. I can tell you right now, teachers are exhausted, and they've worked really, really hard this year, and because they care about students and they care about their success. And so, the boundaries of what the work day is and all of those things, I think that we're going to have to work those things out and settle on something that becomes reasonable, manageable, and positive experience for students and teachers alike.
Yeah, and from a professional learning standpoint, I think we will take a lot from what we've done this last year to try and blend. So that the time that we are spending together will be more focused, because we'll do some of that stuff that we can do and maybe on our own time. And I think that's what we found a lot with teachers, where we were getting higher participation at some of our professional learning just because it was a lot easier just to walk over to the computer at 4 o'clock than to drive to a session. So I think when we blend in some of those things into here's some stuff that you can do before we meet, then we're going to get together and this is what we're going to talk about. And then when you go away, here's some other things that you can do, so that we can use what we've learned to try and make an experience both face-to-face and virtually.
For sure, and I'll just draw your attention to a comment in the chat that there's a lot of misunderstanding between what COVID distance education looks like versus good pedagogy distance education. And I think that's very fair, Karen. And I guess my wondering, and I was a parent who had a grade 7 kid come home in March, and we've actually been quite fortunate this year that she's been home very little, but I was actually just talking to a teacher who's also a parent on Friday, who her son has been in school 15 days since February 15th. So the disruption of, like, physically in school because of isolation, because of, all of the things that we all know are happening. And I guess I just want to do a little bit of a follow-up on this, on the parent question. So we've had parents see distance education through the lens of COVID, which was, in March, it was, what did teachers have, a week? It was not necessarily as supported as we would like. We've acknowledged that. And it was all teachers. So it wasn't teachers putting up their hand and saying, yeah, I'd love to try distance learning. It was everybody. Congratulations, you're a distance learning teacher. I'm curious as to what impact that's going to have on our distance learning programs as we continue them post-COVID. And I'm with you, Kelsey. I don't think we're there yet. I'm seeing with my own now grade 8 student, we're not there yet. But what kind of impact is that going to have on distance education? Because I can see from a parent the positives of, wow, you know, that all of these things are possible. But I also wonder if there's going to be some of the negatives that perhaps Jay was alluding to a bit. Well, is there consistency? You know, my kid wasn't very engaged, those kinds of things. How do we manage that long term as we develop and continue to develop distance learning in our province? All of our teachers have had a bit of a exposure to it, but so have our parents, at least the parents that chose to participate from March to June, and then the parents that didn't. But then also this year, when it's been kind of still in crisis and bounced back and forth, what do we take from all of that moving forward as we continue to do what Karen refers to as good pedagogy distance education that is developed in the ways that JS was talking about, where there's time and there's resources and there's energy. Now that everyone's had this kind of almost a distance ed light, I hate to call it that, but that's almost what it became. So any thoughts on that?
It'd be interesting to see the connection without the COVID kind of cloud over distance education. And I think the important piece to take away from it is that we need to give it the time and the respect that it deserves as a quality teaching tool. And I think in the case during the pandemic, the time wasn't there. It wasn't an option. So it was boom, in we go, and it's survival mode. And so I think the time really and really is a silver lining type of a situation where we've now had the experience. There's no excuse to say we haven't had the experience, and we've been pushed into that. And so what are we going to take from it? We're going to take some time, and we need to plan it properly and train our teachers properly, and give our parents that the positives of what can come from this. And I think there is a lot. And so looking at it from a provincial standpoint as well, I think is important. And I think that each school division deserves that as well. And because there are little pockets of expertise all over the place. And so bringing those people together and helping each other to develop a system. And so I think the parents' time is going to be the blessing that we're going to need, and kind of cut the cord between COVID and distance ed and say there's two different things here that we need to really talk about. And so we can't associate the two for very much longer. They have to be two separate entities, and hopefully that will make the shift that we need.
Yeah, and I think school divisions have learned, a lot of them had a distance learning component in their school divisions that was just this little kind of quiet thing off in the corner that had, a few kids in it. Just like my job, I was the nerd in the corner until COVID hit, and then I was center stage on everything. So now school divisions are getting a better idea of what distance education is. So I'm wondering what funding is going to look like. Are they going to provide more resources to that? Are they going to maybe try and expand it and build on some of the learning that's happened? And is it going to take more of a center stage moving forward? And just, Ellen, I'll let you know there's a couple of hands up too. But
Jay or Lisa, do you want to wade in before maybe we get to the hands up? Or are we good?
Well, I'm just going to make a couple comments to the two things in the chat. But you know what, Jay, if you're speaking to the previous conversation, I'll let you go ahead and speak first.
No, I'm good. I didn't want our guests to wait, so I'm happy to go after Lisa to the other people.
Well, just the two comments about the an open access resource hub, and but it's not doesn't work for everybody. So those are two things that are part of our new distance learning policy. So this was in the works. We had this policy, it's an STF policy on distance learning, was in the works prior to COVID. And but we sort of accelerated it, and it is now, it was now passed, and it will now move forward next year and be implemented. But the two things that are there in the chat are part of the policy, where that materials created through publicly funded education should be made available freely throughout the public education system. So that's definitely one of our beliefs in this policy. And also the distance learning best meets a student's educational needs. So it isn't always the best avenue for every learning situation, and for some it may not be, and it may be for certain things but not others. So to keep those things in mind.
Thank you, Lisa. So I see both Raquel and Karen have their hands up. Jay, do you want to unmute a mic and let them go ahead?
Sure, Karen, I'll let you go first.
Hi there. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, well, I've been teaching 100% online this whole school year to grade 9s, to a grade 9 homeroom. And so, what we've been, absolutely, it doesn't work for every single student. Out of 35 kids, I've got about 9 that aren't engaged at all whatsoever. And no matter what I try, I can't seem to get them. I guess one thing we can't forget about online learning is it gives students kind of a place to hide from public education. And I'm not sure what we can do about that, because if the parents let it happens very easily. And so, back in the days of truant officers, how do we find these kids that are sort of falling between the cracks? And I think, I don't know if anything like that is in the STF policy, or if that's anything that we could even put in there. But, the advocacy for that is definitely very valuable. I am very glad that the STF is going to have a distance education or a remote learning environment policy, because there's so much discrepancy through the province. Yes, in COVID we all did it, and it was kind of put together as best we can. But now, there's teachers that have, the focus needs to be good pedagogy, which is absolutely possible in online learning. Like, we do group work, we do collaboration, we do collaborative and cooperative learning. We have synchronous sessions, but lots of distance education doesn't have synchronous sessions. And I guess through my experiences, I've developed these beliefs that we can do so much more with a remote learning environment. And this research is just touching the surface of it. And yeah, there's just so much more that we can do with it. But I know that the fear is it will never replace face-to-face, but for some students, it works really, really well. Like, for some students, it does, but boy, my EAL students really, really struggle with it. Very, very much so, because when you're not face-to-face, it's so language-based. And so my EAL students do struggle. And so that's another possible area of research even. But I don't know. I know I'm kind of babbling on, but I'm just so glad to be here tonight and listen to everybody's perspectives. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Does anyone want to respond to Karen before we go on to Raquel, or should we go on to Raquel and then respond to both hands? Up to you guys. Raquel, go ahead. Jay, can you unmute, please?
Well, I'm so thrilled to be here as well. I'm just thrilled to hear all of your research and it's coming out. And I really think there's a lot of themes to be explored beyond what we're talking about, especially, you know, as you mentioned, referencing back to students with anxiety issues. And I think a lot of those anxiety issues were present in students taking DL to begin with. There's some shortfalls that I think we have in the face-to-face classroom that sometimes we have a lot of students with anxiety who do choose the route of distance learning. And this was prior to COVID being a very different time and created very different stressful pieces to this. I guess what I just wanted to add to the narrative on this particular piece, and it's a quote that I hear mentioned often, is that distance learning isn't for every student. And I guess what I want to suggest, just to add into that narrative, because I think that the conversation is around the same thing, but when we pose this statement to say that distance learning isn't for all students, I just always invite people to think about why we don't say that about face-to-face learning. So when we talk about face-to-face learning, we don't say face-to-face is not for every student. What we do is we see students who are struggling and we put in the proper resources and we put in the proper thinking strategies, learning strategies. We support their skills. We create tangible goals. We put in PD for our teachers and we train them in that piece. And so I guess I would just invite just to shift sometimes in the conversation in terms of why don't we say that to face-to-face, that it's not good for every face-to-face student. We just don't, because if a student is struggling, what can we do to help? And I guess perhaps what I suggest in there is it devalues distance learning to say it's not for every student. Therefore, we don't put in the resources, we don't put in the training, we don't put in we don't focus on what are the distance learning skill sets that our students need. And there are some very unique learning skills in distance learning that are absolutely teachable, learnable, and that have measurable outcomes. And I would suggest they're hidden within the curriculum, but they certainly can be brought out in there. So I guess just as I hear all those things, I think we're always saying the same thing in there, because I hear everybody saying the wonderful things that can happen through distance learning and that we found out that there's some great things that can. And yeah, I guess I just put that out there to as an addition to the conversation in the way we're still thinking of two modes of learning rather than as what you mentioned in the distance learning policy that's in there, that we're choosing the learning that's best for the student. And also just backing that up with, we're also supporting equitably our students in whatever learning mode they choose or whatever learning mode they have to take. Some students have to take distance learning, and it's not sufficient for us to say it doesn't work for everybody. We need to be pushing for that equitable support from all levels in the system. So I appreciate this conversation. I have so many things written down here that I am just excited about that have come from your research. And so thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you for that, Raquel. Just before I turn it over to any of you that want to jump in, just listening to both Karen and to Raquel's conversation, it takes me back to something that Kelsey talked about in her research. And that was that whole digital divide and the concepts of equity and the concepts of access. And what we're finding as researchers, you know, my other hat at the Federation is that I'm a researcher and policy analyst. What we're finding in the research is that COVID has really exacerbated some of that divide, whether it be students simply not taking school, whether it be students struggling in distance learning, or whether it be students struggling in classrooms with the additional restrictions that are in place. So as we think about how to move through this and what this is going to look like towards the end, you know, or once the pandemic ends, what have we learned around both the digital divide and I would suggest a social economic divide that might be able to better support students, whether that be in distance learning or not? And I just see a request to reply, Karen. I'm going to invite some of the panelists to speak, and then absolutely you can have an opportunity to reply.
Well, that is a really good point. And I mean, even when I was a consultant back in the day, we would have teachers say, well, I don't do technology. We would say, well, that's kind of like saying I don't do math or I don't do reading. We wouldn't accept that as a response for other things. And it is in the curriculum, and there are things that require technology in the curriculum. So there are things that we need to, given the proper supports. And I think that's what I take away from Raquel's comment. Given the proper supports, it could be it could be useful for students that maybe aren't finding use in it now.
I find it interesting when you put it into the words that you chose to, it really does shine a kind of different light on it. So I do think comfort level with distance education does play a role. And I think a comfort level across the board from superintendents to administrators in schools to teachers themselves. And so I do think education is a huge part of that. We need to educate people as to what distance education can entail and what it can do. And hopefully that can build that. And so even when you talk about policy, so Saskatchewan is not really up to snuff with other provinces and territories in terms of policy. Like I think there's one other province with us that really there isn't a whole ton when we're looking and comparing to other provinces. So I applaud the STF for putting together a policy. I guess that would be about the first one that we're going to see as a province. And so when you compare it to British Columbia and Alberta, it's quite extensive policy in place. And so it's a step in the right direction too. And I do think it really is the training and making sure that people understand that this is doable and there's different components that need to be addressed. But I mean, when we talk about making accommodations for learners, we do it all the time in face-to-face environments. It's just the norm. We really don't even think about it. We just do it. And that's where distance education needs to get to eventually. We're not there, but in a perfect world, I'd love for it to be there.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, if I can just jump in, and I really appreciate the discussion, and I'm glad when it comes from the attendees and not just the people who are here to talk, and just really important foundational aspects, and getting back to what Kelsey said in terms of cutting the cord between COVID and distance learning. I think that is going to be, we have, if we're talking about the development of distance learning, we've used the opportunity of COVID, and I'm sorry I frame it that way, and it's not an opportunity for everyone, but to see where we're going and if we can leave that part behind and do a better job. But one thing in particular that struck me in terms of what Raquel shared is that notion of access and how our students need access to learning, and sometimes the technology is the best way to do it. And mental health has been such an important factor, or maybe non-factor in a lot of ways during what we've gone through, and our ability to access and engage students who struggle or who have physical impairments that don't allow them to get into the classroom, and how some of those positives have come out of this in terms of them connecting and being on an even playing field. And we've talked about that for years, about people who are bullied or can't be seen as equals in the classroom when they are on a virtual environment or in a virtual reality, all those blue sky ideas. And some of them are finally coming true. And I think that's a really important thing that you raised, Raquel, is that notion of access. And we are here in the teaching and learning business. We're not here in this, to stream all of these students in one or the other. We're trying to find the best fit for them. And I think that this is opening our eyes for some more of those best fits.
Okay, thank you, Jay. Jay, would you be willing to turn Karen's mic back on? She'd like to make another comment.
Well, Raquel, I think what you've said is very, very important. And yes, the students who are active in our classes, we've definitely made adaptations for them. For my EAL students, definitely adaptations and you know, people with atypical needs can definitely exist and coexist within a distance learning or remote learning environment. I guess what I was talking about are students who would need like maybe a full-time EA, students who need somebody sitting beside them for 2 to 3 hours a day to get anything out of them. You know, that's, as a remote learning teacher, I have no control over that. Whereas if they were sitting in front of me, I would have at least some influence on that, or I could at least, you know, have impactful, you know, an impactful, you know, trying to make a plan for them. One thing that really surprised me is that when you are in the remote learning environment, not only do you need to have a positive relationship with the students, you have to have that relationship with the families. It's like 100 times more important in this situation than in the classroom. I mean, it's always important, but wow. You know, it's really, really neat. But, you know, often in distance learning, this is a little bit off topic, but, you know, one thing you want to make, a person wants to make sure that the kids don't miss out on is the interaction with each other. And I think in distance learning that's quite often missed, is that the student to student interactions. And I know when I taught last spring, it definitely was more teacher directed, you know, because we were all in kind of emergency delivery. But what we've been able to create this year has just been incredible in terms of student to student interaction. But Raquel, I definitely appreciate, and I'm going to change my narrative, absolutely. But there are still some situations where I find it hard to imagine that we could make it successful for the student. And that's just, ultimately, we want success for the student for sure. But maybe it just takes a creative vision, you know, to do those kinds of things. But anyway, thank you for letting me share, you guys. I could talk about this for hours because I've enjoyed my time this year so much. I've created, I've learned, I've invented. It's been the most amazing year of my career, to be honest.
Thank you for that, Karen. I appreciate it. And it's interesting how things get referenced as challenges and opportunities. And I always say teachers are just endless optimists. It always amazes me. You know, you put in these McDowell grants and I say, it's going to be a whole lot of work. And you're like, yes. I'm like, okay, well, let's go. All right. I see we're about 8:15. So I do want us to start thinking about wrapping up the conversation. I guess my question for each of you on the panel would be, there are a number of leaders that registered for this session and that have participated in this session. What do you want to say to them about distance learning, and in fact about how distance learning needs to change as we move forward based on what you've learned over the past 18 months?
Well, I guess I'll go first on that one. I think for me, it's basically give it the respect that it deserves, and that distance education deserves as much time and effort as a face-to-face environment. And I think that's a big shift that we need to make. It's not just a thing anymore. It's been with us for a long time. Distance education has been part of education for a very long time, but the light has now shone on it, and there is a lot of value in it, but it does deserve the time to prepare for it and to teach our teachers how to be successful with it and experience those with our learners. And so that's, I think, my biggest take from this and hope from this, is that it really does get the time and respect that it deserves. And when I say it's distance education and what it can do for education and our students in our province and for our teachers. So
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I can go next. It's hard to follow up really great stuff like that, but yeah, there is some really excellent expertise. There's some great institutions in the province doing distance learning. Think of the work that SunWest has done in particular. They have been really innovative, and I think part of this is just making sure everybody gets along and plays nice and shares, but also that we are communicating around this so that we do have a provincial policy. I'm really happy to hear the STF is putting some stuff together, because we are lacking. Once the correspondence school, people can remember that, shut down, we didn't really have any kind of policy directive, or everybody was basically doing it on their own. And I think it's a way to maybe bring people together to be more consistent and to have a province-wide approach to do all the good things. So COVID goes away, yay, we have a big party. We don't hopefully have to worry about that for another 100 years. But what are we learning in terms of better teaching and instruction? And for the places that it fits, distance learning, distance education, that needs to be a part of what we do moving forward. And again, there are lots of challenges, but there's always opportunities in every situation like we've been through.
Yeah, I guess just moving forward to build on those positives, and I'll say it again, include the voice of teachers. Listen to teachers. Listen to people like Kelsey, who's doing the research. Listen to the teachers like the ones that Kelsey had participate in her study. And listen to what they're experiencing. Listen to the distance learning teacher specialists. There's experts out there who have been doing it more than just COVID. Don't just listen to teachers who have had their experience during COVID, which will be very valuable, but also listen to the experience that from distance teachers. It's been around for over 20 years. So to take all of that knowledge moving forward. And there's a huge need for resources, professional development, research, information on all of this. And like I think we're just really at the start of a lot of work that is to come. And technology is a huge part of education, and it'll just keep getting bigger. So to stay on top of it is a pretty big task, but I mean, what COVID did do, and I know it's not something anybody here wants to have to relive, I'm sure, but there are opportunities that will come out of it, and it's really opened our eyes, I think, a lot to what the possibilities are with distance learning, because they're huge. There's lots of possibilities, and I think all of that's just really been accelerated, and it's exciting to see what direction that's going to take in the future moving forward.
And I think what we learned trying to provide professional learning for teachers was that not everybody had the same access. So we had school divisions where teachers still had to travel to the school because they didn't have adequate access in their homes. And that's the teachers. So you can imagine the students that they're teaching are probably in the same boat. And some school divisions were able to, hey, we're going to redo these library computers anyway. Let's give them to students. Not every school division had that opportunity. So I guess, kind of preparing for, and not that this is going to happen again, and hopefully we don't have to prepare for that, but just to make, if people do want to continue using distance learning, that they have that opportunity. It's not well, we would, but we don't have the resources to do it. So I think we really need to advocate for the resources and funding to make sure that we can continue to learn from what we've learned.
Thank you all for that. Anyone have any final last words before I wrap up? I agree with the chat. Thank you, Kelsey. Your research is amazing. I'm so grateful you shared it with us here, and I'm looking forward to reading both your McDowell report as well as the dissertation that I know you're very close to finished on. So yes, I know we've been chatting. So I'm excited to see both of those. When you put forward your application last summer, and was successful, I was very, very happy that there was a research project focusing specifically on distance learning as part of this work, because I think it's been just such a big part of COVID. And while the other projects were important, I mean, the other projects looked at teacher well-being and student well-being and the experiences of immigrant and refugee students, which was all important. Your project has very much tied across, I think, the broader scope of COVID. So I'm so glad you let us fund it, and I'm so glad you're sharing your work with us. I mean, it's really important. Thank you to the rest of you for sitting on the panel as well. I know it's June. We were just discussing before we started the webinar that June is not a great month for any of us. It's a busy time, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come and participate here tonight, as well as to those who attended. I appreciate you giving up a nice evening in June to do that. The mission of the McDowell Foundation is really about supporting teacher-led research in the province, teachers like Kelsey. And it's really important to us not only that this research happen, but that there's opportunities for teachers, other educational leaders, and decision makers to really be able to access that research and be able to implement it into the work they're doing. So we're so happy to provide this opportunity for spaces like this where these conversations can happen. But we hope that these conversations continue in classrooms, in staff rooms, and in boardrooms where decisions are being made about education. The foundation exists because we believe in the professionalism of teachers. We believe in the importance of teachers doing their own research in order to inform themselves and to inform others. But it doesn't happen without our donors and without the support of the STF. So thank you as well. I know some of our donors did sign on tonight. Thank you as well for your donation to the foundation. That's how we're able to do what we can do. So for information on other research projects, or if you're interested in becoming a donor, feel free to head to the McDowell Foundation website. Otherwise, thank you so much for taking the time tonight. Have a good evening. Have a good rest of June. Survive to the end, and then we'll pick it up again in the fall. So thank you so much for your time. Have a good night, everyone.